All right, it is 7 o'clock on the dot. I'm going to hit broadcast and then I will mute myself. Have a great time, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we're ready to get started. We'll let everyone join us. And I think we're ready to begin. So hello, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. My name is Leah. I'm a bookseller of politics and prose, and I have the honor of being your host today. Thank you so much for joining us and tuning in this virtual format, which allows us to continue to bring amazing authors and their important books to readers like you. I'm so excited to welcome our very special guests today, Linda Barrett Osborne, along with Alan Miller, in this very timely and essential discussion of the freedom of the press and the nature of the news, past, present, and future. So if you haven't already, you can click on the link we'll drop in the chat to get your own copy of Linda's newest book, Guardians of Liberty, as well as her other awesome and informative titles. If you have a question for our guests this evening, you can click on the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen and add one there. At the end of our chat, our guests will have time to answer some of your questions. You can also vote on those questions that you like and really want answered. And as always, please remember that this is a creative, safe space, and we ask that friends be respectful of one another in their questions and comments. And as always, thank you so much for supporting and joining us this evening. So now on to the event you're all waiting for. It is my honor to introduce author, editor, and truth teller, Linda Barrett Osborne, a celebrated writer of young adult nonfiction. Her books have challenged readers to look critically at history, from depicting the melting pot of America to the struggles and efforts of the civil rights movement. These books include Traveling the Freedom Road, Come On In, America, and This Land is Our Land, A History of American Immigration, which was a YALSA Excellence in Young Adult Nonfiction finalist and a Carter G. Woodson Honor Book. Linda is also a former senior writer and editor in the Library of Congress Publishing Office and local to Washington, D.C. And tonight, we are celebrating her newest book, Guardians of Liberty, Freedom of the Press and Nature of the News. And tonight, Linda is joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Alan Miller. A former Los Angeles Times reporter, Alan is the founder and CEO of the News Literacy Project, a nonpartisan national education nonprofit that provides tools and resources on news, information, and literacy to educators and the public. So it is my pleasure to pass it over to Linda and Alan. The virtual stage is yours. Thank you so much.
I would like to start by thanking Alan very much for agreeing to interview me. We have so much in common about our interests and in working with young people. I'd like to thank Politics and Prose for making this available, this interview available. I'd like to thank Leah for the great introduction, Heidi for the tech, Margaret for organizing this. And I'd like to thank the people at Abrams. There are so many of them, but especially my editor, Howard Reeves, who has done, this is my 5th book with him, and Sarah, the editorial assistant who got me through, and also Mary Marola, who's helping with publicity. And finally, I'd like to thank all my friends, because I know a bunch of you are watching, and I'd like to thank even more those people who don't know me and are watching. So now, Alan, I'm ready for your questions.
Thanks, Linda. It's a pleasure to be with all of you virtually and with Politics and Prose, as well as Linda, to discuss her timely and topical book. So Linda, let's start with first things first, and the framers in the First Amendment. Tell us what their intent was here.
Well, actually, I'm going to start briefly with my intent, because in 2017, I've been reading over and over again about fake news, which we were all reading about and have been. And I came upon this quote in October from President Trump. And this is the quote. It's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want to write, and people should look into it. So I said, okay, I'll look into it. And this is not fake news, by the way, this is a true story of how I started the book. So I started with the Founding Fathers. They envisioned, to answer your question, the press as a watchdog against government abuses of power. You know, you've got to remember that they were reacting to the British royal government's treatment of the colonies. It's interesting that the person the framers most feared could abuse power was the president. not Congress, not the Supreme Court, but the president. They even considered not having a president for a while. They also believed that a democracy needs an active, vital press representing all points of view to encourage debate and open discussion of ideas and to create an informed citizenry. And finally, they wanted to protect against prior restraint, which meant censorship by the government before something is printed. That's the roundup of the founding fathers and what they intended to do.
So as you know, many Americans are not familiar with the five freedoms that are covered under the First Amendment, never mind how they're applied. So let's drill down a little bit on speech in particular. Can you address this, the freedom of speech, particularly as it concerns contemporary issues like the role of the social media platforms and speech on college campuses?
Okay, well, you know, speech and press are sometimes hard to distinguish, and they both come under freedom of expression. So a little bit of my answer may be covering both. Anyway, one way or the other, both are covered by the First Amendment. Okay, you know, what is important to remember is that the First Amendment only applies to the federal government. It did not even apply to state government censorship laws until a 1923 case. It was Gitlow versus New York, when the Supreme Court ruled for the first time on a state court decision concerning freedom of the press by applying the Equal Laws Clause of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so social media platforms, which are private, are not covered by the First Amendment. And this works both ways. I mean, the government has the power to challenge what can be placed on social media, and social media have the power to remove what is posted, as we've seen lately with some misinformation and outright lying tweets. And I think that power should be exercised. In terms of the actions of students who force colleges to cancel speeches by controversial figures, and they are usually on the right, the figures, not the students, I'm afraid that really does go against the intention of the First Amendment. And I'll read another quote. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote in 1929, "If there is any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it is the principle of free thought. Not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought we hate." And that is an extremely difficult concept to come to grips with. However, I do think what is acceptable about what is appropriate and acceptable for people to say and write is changing over time. I think that those who preach racism, anti-Semitism, hate, violence, harmful views, have other platforms available to them to speak as much as they wish on their topics besides a college setting. And so intellectually, I think of myself as a proponent of free speech and the press, but personally, I think that incitement to violence and hate speech should be limited or censored. And in fact, that's just what we do for national security. We do set limits to the First Amendment.
Well, we'll get back to national security in a minute, but in the meantime, you mentioned changes over time. So the book addresses a number of landmark cases involving speech and press. Can you talk about some of those that are most significant and how they shape the applicability of the First Amendment over history?
Okay, good. Well, I have several cases in the book, but I'll just give you 4 examples. And the first 2 come from the World War I era. One is Schenck versus the United States, which was heard in 1919. And Schenck had published pamphlets calling for draft resistance during World War I. This is where it's a written publication, but it's not by a journalist, but it's not exactly speech either. This is what I mean where speech and press sometimes get confused. Anyway, the Supreme Court affirmed the guilty decision. And this is the case where Oliver Wendell Holmes gave what became sort of guidelines for free speech after that. He gave the example in this case of prohibiting a man shouting fire in a crowded theater as an acceptable limit to freedom of speech. Okay, so there were limits that were acceptable. He also used the phrase clear and present danger. And as I say, these have become guidelines over the years for deciding between national security issues and freedom of the press. And now, the second case, same thing, Abrams versus United States. This one upheld a decision that leaflets calling on strikes in munition plants during the war could be censored. And of course, the Supreme Court agreed that they should be censored. Holmes dissented this time. He said we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe, unless an immediate check is required to save the country. Okay, now I'm going to skip to two more in the 60s and early 70s, both involved the New York Times. One was the New York Times Company versus Sullivan in 1964. Okay, I explained so much more about these cases in the books than I'm able to do now, so I'm hoping I'm giving enough information on them. Okay, then in this case, the Supreme Court reversed an Alabama court decision that called for the Times to pay a huge fine for allegedly libeling Alabama officials. And this was in an ad that was placed by a civil rights group in the New York Times. The court held, the Supreme Court held, that even though there were some small mistakes in the ad, it had been validly exercising its right to freedom of the press by printing the ad, the New York Times. And a second case involved the Pentagon Papers in 1971. The Washington Post and the New York Times had both printed part of the Pentagon Papers. The federal government jumped in. They wanted to suppress further publication and basically impose what was prior restraint, which, as I mentioned when you asked the first question, was something the founding fathers did not want to happen. Again, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the newspapers, citing the First Amendment right to print the study. I'm not a lawyer to answer the second part of your question, but it seems to me that the World War I cases came out on the side of national security rather than press freedom. But in the 1960s and 70s, the court further articulated support for freedom of the press and helped define it. And they reflected public opinion at the time. But since we've had over 200 years of different Supreme Courts, and they have issued very different opinions on similar issues, I would not assume the current or any future court would uphold press freedom to the same extent that we did in the 60s and 70s.
So you mentioned President Trump in your opening. Of course, presidents dating all the way back to George Washington have had fraught relationships with the press. And during the time of Washington and the other founding fathers, the press was strictly partisan. The notions of fairness, balance, objectivity didn't really emerge until the early 20th century. Right. Even Thomas Jefferson, who was famously a proponent of press freedom, by the time he left the White House, as you write, had a very negative view of the press. In fact, he went so far as to say, he wrote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper." Talk a little bit about this long history of conflict between presidents and the press.
And there is a long history, which we should all remember. I'll just say that partisan press on both sides can be very nasty, insulting, and that knows no time or place. No president gets all positive press because we're Americans and we disagree on everything. So how can our newspapers do too? So how can it get all positive press? But none on record that I could find like negative press. And Benjamin Franklin's nephew wrote of George Washington that he was, quote, possessed of powers to multiply evils upon the United States. This is George Washington, who you think, would be perfect. Actually, Washington didn't comment. John Adams, and this is one of my favorite second presidents of the United States, one of my favorite quotes in the book. He was called, quote, a strange compound of ignorance and ferocity, of deceit and weakness, who has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Adams fought back because he persuaded Congress to pass the 1798 sedition law, and that made the author of any negative comments about the majority party in power subject to fines and imprisonment, and that act was actively enforced. Now we go to, in fact, an act like that free censors didn't come about again until Woodrow Wilson's administration passed the laws in the around the World War I period. Now I'll go to Abraham Lincoln because he got arguably the most vicious abuse in the present, maybe tied with Jefferson. From the Southern papers, from the Copperhead papers in the North that supported the South, and even pro-union press after he announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, because even Northerners were racist and pretty upset about it. Okay, now Lincoln himself was very restrained in his defense. Instead, he let the press fight it out, the pro-Lincoln and the anti-Lincoln press, until one incident in 1864, he had 2 reporters and editors from 2 different newspapers in prison for printing a false proclamation, fake news, as it were. They were saying that Lincoln was calling for more people to be drafted, which was not true. And it was meant to upset Lincoln supporters and criticize him. Okay, Richard Nixon. He famously told 2 of his national security advisors, I think it's famous, I've done a lot of reading on this, I hope people remember it. Never forget, the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. Write that on a blackboard 100 times. And Nixon kept an enemies list that included many journalists. He had their IRS question their tax returns, and the FBI tapped their phones. Now, I haven't yet mentioned the next president I talk about, because Alan's going to ask a question, I think, about him.
So given that sort of historical context, you write that President Trump has taken this antipathy to another level by constantly deriding the press, and much of it as fake news, and calling it the enemy of the American people. Why do you feel that he is different from his predecessors, and why is it, as you write in the book, that you find this troubling?
Well, as you said, fake news does go back more than 2 centuries, if not further, although I believe at times Trump has said that he invented it. And Benjamin Franklin used it in the 18th century to stir up colonial passion against the British. Okay, and you can read more in my book about my favorite example of fake news. And it's a series of stories that was run by the New York Sun newspaper in 1835 that claimed that men lived on the moon with scientific proof. And many people believed it. And those who didn't were entertained, which, by the way, was a main function of newspapers in the mid-19th century, to entertain people. In any case, whether they believed it or not, sales of the newspaper skyrocketed, as the sensational tends to do. Now, I use that example to make the distinction between what I call actual fake news, and that is a deliberate hoax, and what President Trump calls fake news, which is news that he doesn't like. Okay, why is he different than, for example, Nixon? Well, he uses the phrase fake news incessantly. He discredits not just the press itself, but the entire foundation of reasonable truth. And as you pointed out, he calls news not just his enemy, but the enemy of the American people. He's saying over and over again how dangerous they are and how lucky we are to have him to give us the truth. Okay, one example in my book is his comments to the VFW convention in 2018, and you may all remember this, where he pointed to the press and said, "Don't believe the crap you see from these people." This quote is actually confirmed on the White House website. They post his speeches, and this is you can check them yourself. And further, he said, "Just remember, what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what is happening." In addition, he has denied access to press conferences to accredit reporters. And finally, Trump is different because he has the technology to reach people without going through the press. In his first 465 days in office, by the way, he tweeted 3,201 times directly to the public.
All right, let's go. You had mentioned national security earlier, and the book tells the long history of the tension of striking a balance between national security interests and press freedom, particularly during times of war and heightened concern about state secrets. And you use examples that date back to from the Civil War, the 2 World Wars, Vietnam, in the wake of 9/11. Describe this historical tension and your sense of how the press has fared during these times.
Okay, and I'm going to rush through this because there's a lot more about national security in the book than I can say in this interview. In different forms of censorship have applied for different wars. Now, during the Civil War, objectionable newspapers were effectively censored by not allowing them to be sent through the mail. Who knew that even then, mail was such an issue? And if they couldn't go through the mail, they couldn't get to readers. Woodrow Wilson's postmaster general, and his name was Albert Burleson, he used this ability extensively, mostly, almost exclusively, to censor or not allow mailing of socialist and communist publications. And of course, during the World War I, the 1917 Espionage Act and the 1918 Sedition Act, placed draconian restriction on what was considered unpatriotic and disloyal press. And that's why you had the two Supreme Court cases that I mentioned before. Now, World War II had voluntary restrictions, and every media outlet did follow them. They didn't report on troop movements, ugly deaths, nothing ugly, nothing that showed that war was as horrible as it was. Everything had to be the soldiers are brave and we're winning. But in fact, mainstream media through the middle of the 20th century were not nearly as censored as socialist, communist, and fascist publications and radio broadcasts. This is interesting. They tend to follow the line and sometimes support wars that we later come to decide were unnecessary. Korean War, General MacArthur ordered involuntary censorship when reporters started to note that we were losing. Okay. Now, interestingly, reporters were actually free to travel in Vietnam, and negative print, radio and TV coverage, it was not censored. And, especially there was heavy criticism after the Tet Offensive in 1968, and yet we all saw that and read about it in the newspapers. So I don't think the government liked that. And when we got to the first Gulf War, the government came up with the pool system, placing reporters in groups and basically feeding them information. And during George W. Bush's Iraq War, a restricted number of reporters were embedded. And they were able to be in battle zones, which most reporters want, but again, only allowed to see the war from the perspective of the government. Thank goodness there are still journalists ready to go beyond these bounds. Now, since 9/11 and the continued war on terrorism, national security has become boundless. It's not tied to any one battle or place. It has no boundaries. And so the government can bring it up as a reason to censor or limit publication of almost anything. I think that by manipulating the press through pools and embedding, though, and restricting access to sensitive information, which is also in my book, hounding the press that reports the stories of whistleblowers, another section in my book, and guiding the press to write what you could pretty reasonably be seen as government propaganda, I think journalists may not have the same freedom of the press that they did during the Vietnam and the Korean Wars. On to you, back to you.
So you've given us a sense of the book's sort of sweep of history. I want to bring things to sort of contemporary times and the creation of the internet and digital media, which of course have transformed the news and information landscape. Talk a little bit about how on the one hand, this has really democratized this, the way people both not only get news and information, but in which they have an opportunity to have their voices heard, and also the challenges that it has spawned for journalism and democracy itself.
I'm sorry. I was thinking of the answer to another question. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Now I have my thoughts together. Anyone is free. This is our digital era. Anyone is free to express her or his opinions on digital media, and I think that's the good news. Anyone is free to express his or her opinions on digital media, and that's the bad news. The internet is the main source of information now. I used a 2017 survey in the book. I think things have actually gotten worse since then. 43% of Americans reported that they got their news online. This was closing in even on the number who got their news from watching television. Never mind that an even smaller percentage of people mainly got their news from print media. And that all these numbers are shrinking. Yet the internet conveys much more opinion, as well as conspiracy theories, hoaxes, other falsehoods, than it does actual fact. And there's often no buffer or context to help judge whether what we're reading or seeing is reliable. There are no professional journal standards for accuracy. And well, why is this bad for democracy? I think the sense of uncertainty this promotes undermines public trust, and it also causes seemingly unbridgeable divisions among us. Professional journalism has traditionally held government and businesses and communities accountable for their actions. And that's because they are openly covered in the press, so people can read about them and know what's happening. Now we have the demise of local and even large city newspapers for economic reasons. There are many fewer journalists to focus on bad practices, and when that happens, corruption tends to thrive. And the challenge for journalists is to find an economically viable way to continue investigative work. And I think we also need to protect and promote local journalism sources that hold local government accountable, as well as larger city newspapers. The alternatives are not great. One is to rely on nonprofit supporters. ProPublica, it's a pioneering, award-winning nonprofit journalism organization, and it has a large full-time staff. And it funds journalists at various smaller newspapers for a year to cover stories concerning local and regional accountability. And another is Report for America, which places young journalists in newsrooms for about a year to cover stories that otherwise might not be covered. I could just add this, and this is kind of spontaneous. A lot of us get our news now from newspapers online, and we do not pay for those subscriptions. That's part of the economic problem as well. So if more people paid for online subscriptions, that might give newspapers more funds to work with. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I certainly support the notion that that people should support their local news outlets so that they will continue to have journalism that keeps them well informed and serves as a watchdog on government and other institutions.
Yes, and in fact, I think there have been studies that show that people actually are more likely to believe their local reporting than they are national and international news, because they're living in the communities, they can see what's happening, and they get to know the reporters, the style of the newspaper. Local news is really challenged these days, and as I say, I don't see a solution, but the internet, the presence of the internet has something to do with that. Anyway.
Yes, there have also been studies showing that where there's a robust local news outlet, the people in that community tend to be more civically engaged.
Yes.
Being informed.
Informed citizenry, just like the founding fathers wanted.
Exactly. So one of the things you write in terms of this fraught information landscape now is that it has left readers and viewers to judge on their own whether what they see and hear seems true. What does this say about the need to educate people, maybe particularly the next generation, on how to be discerning consumers and sharers of news and information?
Oh my God, the need for education about how to judge the news and other sources, whether the news and information is true, whether it's false, is enormous, beyond what I can even imagine. And here, I get to thank you, Alan, because you started the News Literacy Project in 2008. And it provides, people really, look it up, newslit.com. It provides
.org.
.org. I knew that as soon as I said it, because it provides programs and resources that are used by thousands of middle and high school teachers. And they help young people understand how to be intelligent consumers of news and information. You know, they can access your Shakeology, that's Alan's name for it, programs. I wish I had read before I wrote my book. They cover topics like my book does, like how to be a watchdog for democracy, you know, how to understand biases, and biases is a big part of newspapers of all kinds, how to judge arguments, how to judge evidence, you know, how to recognize the importance of world press freedom, and also how important quality journalism is. I think this kind of education is badly needed. Well, not only for young people whom Alan and I write for, and he does his website for, but most adults need to know this as well. My book does also, let me say, have a chapter on restrictions to student press freedom, which I didn't realize had involved two key Supreme Court case decisions. And I also got some comments by high school editors of their newspapers, how important it is for students to be able to deal with controversial issues and not be censored by the school system.
So we're going to go to questions now. The first question actually concerns something that overlaps both of our work, because you mentioned our virtual classroom, Shakeology.org, and in which we deal with the First Amendment. And we have a lesson on the First Amendment among other topics that you mentioned. So I have a question from Katie asking you, Linda, why do you think it's important for middle school and high school students to understand the First Amendment, and how do you make it real for them?
Why I think it's important? I think it's important for young people and children to understand as early as possible most of American history. That's where it starts. That's where our attitudes start. That's where they're formed. That's where we get information. As adults, we tend to be more set in our ways. So that's why I particularly aim at a young audience, because they are the future. They are going to make future history. The more they know and the more accurate information they have, I think the better they'll be able to judge in the future. What was the second part of the question?
How do you make it real for them?
Making it real for them. Well, I know that Shakeology actually has interactive pieces to it and actually uses real journalism cases. I hope that the stories in my book make it, especially, for example, like I got actual students that are editors right now to talk about what they think about press freedom. So they could relate to the kids that are reading these books. I tried to find stories that are entertaining and informative. It's a problem. And I think that the schools have a responsibility, and books have a responsibility, and online people have a responsibility to get the information out there early. I'm not sure if you can't say that about almost anything. How do you make it real for kids? You do the best you can by giving specific examples. And by being passionate yourself, about what you believe in, and by explaining as simply as possible why this is important to connect our history to what happens today.
Yes, you mentioned Shakeology. We give students the opportunity to actually be judges in landmark cases involving speech and press, particularly involving students in schools, and have them say whether they think the cases are covered, and then see how the justices themselves decided the cases and see the reasoning, which we find is very compelling for the students. We have a question. You were talking about the challenges that print newspapers face today. And so we've got a question from Sam. Do you think we will see the end of print newspapers in our lifetime?
Well, our own time depends on how old you are and how old I am. I see a diminishment of print newspapers. I myself find that although I get print newspapers, I go online frequently because I want updates. Let me say this. I'm slightly optimistic that print newspapers will survive as well as digital media. But I think they'll only survive if we as a people act to show we are concerned and support print newspapers and support all media, by demanding honesty and accountability. I mean, if the past 4 years has shown us anything, it's that you can't take any aspect of democracy for granted. But I don't know if I have the expertise to tell you whether print journalism will survive. Books have, even though people thought that the internet, Kindle, and so on would take over, books have. But I will say that I think older readers like myself rely on much more print journalism, and younger readers like my kids and those younger definitely are moving towards a digital platform. I don't know beyond that.
Linda, let me ask you, do you think what's most important is that the standards of quality journalism, at least the aspirational standards of verification and documentation and context and fairness, survive in whatever form, whether it's online or in print or whatever comes next, that's really the crucial thing here?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is a great point. I'm so glad you made that point. Absolutely. In a sense, the delivery doesn't matter. I've written for online things. My books are in ebooks. The content is what matters, and the standards we hold ourselves to when we produce that content matters. I mean, all journalism is not perfect. I'm talking about a high ideal of journalism, and I do believe it's out there. Not every newspaper or a digital newspaper that can claim to be a journalist follows those rules, but absolutely, no matter what the platform, I think what the world mostly needs is well thought, well argued, fact-based journalism that has integrity.
All right.
Yep.
So we have a question from Ken asking you what you think about well-funded efforts to spread propaganda and opinion in the guise of news.
I think it's inevitable that that's going to happen. I think that it is unavoidable. Our own, I mean, if you look at national security versus press freedom of the last 200 years in my book, a lot of what the government is concerned about when it claims national security is actually controlling the image. And a lot of what is put out by the government for information actually can be called propaganda. Maybe some propaganda is good. It can arouse patriotism and so on. But I think that's one of the things we need kids to learn to distinguish between propaganda and what is based, whether quoting sources, verifying from other sources, no matter what they do, to be able to distinguish propaganda from what we believe is true.
Yes,
but
well, that's
as
actually,
I said, I'm afraid there's a lot of propaganda out there, and there's always going to be.
So your response, Linda, is a perfect lead into Pamela's question, which is asking whether your book addresses how young people can judge what is credible news.
It does. And it talks about checking sources, using multiple sources. I'm not going to give everything that's on the list. One of the things I suggest is that you use what are considered reliable sources, university sources, government, I'm not government, but for example, all the Supreme Court cases word for word. Cornell has them online. Other places have them online. You can actually check the words online. The White House puts up the president's speeches word for word, and I checked and rechecked to make sure I got them out, got them correct. Tweets are, you can go to Twitter and see the tweets of somebody and exactly what they've written. It's not hidden. All you have to do is do a little work. I also suggest that maybe, even for those who, you can clearly see my bias here, think like me, it's probably healthy to check other sources that don't agree, see what they're saying. One of my rules is never, if someone says many people think, stop right there. and doubt. You want to know who thinks and what they think. And finally, I think it would help all of us if we read not only what we believe is correct, but and look at anything to see if diverse points of view are represented, and that's not only on the right but the left. You know, are we including African Americans? Are we including women? Are we including the Christian right? You know, how many points of view are being represented here? Those are some of the things in my book, and Alan's Shakeology has a ton more.
Yes, these are all very worthwhile values here that we're aligned with. Let me ask you about the closing line in your book. You kind of issue a sort of a warning looking ahead, a kind of call to action as well. You wrote, "Freedom of the press will only remain a mainstay of our law and our society as long as we believe in the principle, practice it, and value it." Let me ask you how optimistic you are this will be the case, and conversely, how concerned are you that it will not be?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic only if we are concerned. As I say, we need to demand this. We need to expect it. And we need to educate our children, right? Well, middle school, and for me in high school. We need to educate them to expect and demand it too, to understand their history. Okay, if we don't, then yes, I'm afraid I'm not as optimistic. As I said, I think before, you know, we know now, I think we should know after 4 years that we cannot take anything about democracy for granted. And we need to be concerned citizens and get as much information and think about as much information as we can. Whether that's going to happen, I say cautiously optimistic. And again, I say only if more people than just you and me and the people listening to this broadcast believe that this is important, that accurate news is important, that honesty is important. In fact, I dedicated the book to my 2-year-old granddaughter, Lily, and her generation. I'll read it. Take my glasses off to read. For Lily and her generation, that they may grow up in a country that values honesty and freedom of expression. And we're the ones that make that happen. We're the ones that hold the government accountable. We're the ones that get out news that's accurate. We're the ones that make that happen. So cautiously optimistic.
All right, so I'm going to ask one final question. And you mentioned about holding government accountable. So this is one that's very near and dear to both of our hearts. I spent most of my career as a journalist, as an investigative reporter at the LA Times. And the book talks about the history of investigative reporting, going back, starting with the muckrakers and right through to contemporary times. Why is this role so important in US history, and maybe particularly today?
I love the muckrakers. And, I tell you very quickly, as I said, newspapers started out as sort of partisan press in the late 18th, early 19th century. Then they moved to sort of entertainment and sensationalism. Towards the end of the 19th century, there were a group of newspapers, editors, and journalists who decided that what they wanted was factual news, with news that news and not entertainment. And one of this group of people, the muckrakers, who wrote in the 1890s, were investigative journalists. That meant that they spent a lot of time and doing a lot of research to look into stories, arduous research, to gather evidence. And often this was about political and economic corruption. And the resulting series of articles, and they had so much research that most of them wrote books too, they exposed the dangers and ill effects to ordinary Americans: poverty, racism and lynching, unsafe food production, and God, it was disgusting when you read about what they were doing, and it probably still is. Monopolies, business monopolies. Okay, that is what the muckrakers wanted to present to the American public, and their writing made a difference because legislation was passed based on what they were describing. Now, 20th century journalists generally followed this model. At least early 20th century journalists did until the internet came. And you can see it in coverage of the Vietnam War, the Watergate expose. Without investigative journalism, like the muckrakers practiced, the public is both uninformed and unprotected. Okay, but as I said before, in-depth coverage costs money and time, and as newspapers lose revenue to social media, cut staff, the press is less able to carry on this function. And it really should be carrying on this function now because it's so badly needed to expose racism, greed, conflict of interest, misinformation, violence that pervade our country and pervade the internet today. So yeah, go back and read the muckrakers. I grew up in the 50s and 60s with a multitude of newspapers. I grew up on Long Island, so there were a multitude of newspapers. The local newspapers, more city newspapers, daily newspapers, morning newspapers, night newspapers. I'm not sure the world will ever go back. It won't go back to that again. But we can still expect and demand that somebody out there is accurately covering the news for us and looking into the issues that other people might want to be hidden. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay. And any more from, oh, okay, here comes Leah.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to pop in and say thank you guys so much for this amazing discussion. And I just want to pop in and ask one more question. We always like to end our discussions with one, as we're all quarantined and hopefully, as you said, reading widely news, but also great books. What are you both reading now?
Alan, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I've just begun Eddie Glaude Jr.'s book, Begin Again, and very much look forward to taking it with me on my vacation, which actually begins tomorrow.
Okay. And I just finished, I can even hold it up, Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy by Margaret Sullivan, which talks extensively and really well about some of the issues we've just talked about today, how lack of local coverage affects democracy. And the novel of Ferrera by Giorgio Bassani, given to me by a very good friend, which is he's the same writer that wrote In the Garden of Quincy Contini's, and it has a lot to do with anti-Semitism during World War II, and it's beautiful.
Thank you both so much. Are there any last short comments to give before we start wrapping this up? Closing remarks?
Buy books on politics and prose, buy books, and demand better standards for journalism.
Thank you both so much. Well, thank you all so much for this amazing discussion and all those who contributed such great questions. And of course, many thanks to Linda, Barrett Osborne, and Alan Miller for joining us this evening and sharing their words and their insights. And of course, thank you all so much, viewers, for joining us. Don't forget, you can still click on the link that will drop again in the chat box to get your own copy of Linda's newest book, Guardians of Liberty, as well as her other important and informative books, as well as we dropped the link to Alan's amazing project as well, so definitely check that out. Also, to find out more about great upcoming events, check out our website for updated listings, and you could follow our Children and Teen Department on social media. We put that over in the link in the chat as well. The handle is posted there. So you can also watch our past events on our Politics and Prose YouTube page, or if you want to watch this again, this will be posted shortly as well. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you all keep reading widely, expanding your world, and keep asking those important questions. So stay safe and have a great evening. Bye. Thank you all so much.
Good night.